They were told they were racially inferior. They were told they lacked the intelligence to handle modern fighter aircraft. They were not supposed to succeed. But in the face of bigotry and ignorance, the Tuskegee Airmen prevailed. With skill and bravery, this all-black fighter squadron shattered racist stereotypes. And their exploits became the stuff of legend. Now you're in the cockpit as red-tailed Mustangs take on swarms of Nazi fighters.
In this video, I would like to explore the concept of black patriotism. Can a black man or woman in this country honestly call themselves patriotic when you consider everything that's been going on?
The 332nd Fighter Group continued in their escort role through the fall of 1944 and winter of 1945. By the beginning of March, the 332nd had accrued a total of 74 air-to-air victories. But as the war dragged on, a new threat appeared in the skies above Germany. A foe that threatened to tip the balance of power in the air, the Me-262 jet fighter. A generational leap in aircraft technology, the Me-262's 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage over the Mustang and its heavy armament made it a lethal threat to American bombers. But in one of the war's great ironies, the Tuskegee Airmen, once maligned as unfit to comprehend modern technology, will draw blood against the seemingly invulnerable Me-262. March 24,
They already knew blacks could fly, but they needed racism to be true. You see,
We know, or should know, that the Tuskegee Airmen weren't the first and only fighter pilots of color flying. Eugene Bullard fought in World War I and fought against the superior German aircraft.
the Fokker DR-1 triplane.
People of color have been in every war, in every crisis, on every side since time began.
There were black Confederates, and can you picture Native American Confederates?
People of Asian descent were in Civil War.
And yes, by now you've guessed it, there were Native Americans in the Revolutionary War. Some sided with the British, some sided with America, but they were on both sides of the war.
You may look at the Indians and figure, well, for them to fight with the British, they had to be under duress. No. The British Empire was the superpower. They had like an 85% chance of whipping the Continental Army, which later became America. So you're going to side with these people who are about to murder and beat down these peasants, farmers, doctors, and lawyers who don't want to go along. You're going to hedge with them, or you're going to hedge with the superpower and maybe get you some gold and guns and one of those giants.
Hispanics also fought for America in the Revolutionary War. In this picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware, look over here. She's a woman. that brings me to the point that whole families would fight, because if the husband went, the whole family would go and fight in the Revolutionary War. And if you know anything about Nancy Hart, woman, she was a spy and shot a few British. The other was Mary Ludwig Hayes, and she fought with America in the way she was a support position. She carried water and other supplies to soldiers in the field. You may think that's not a big deal until you have to figure gunfire and cannon fire is going back and forth, and people just carrying water, nurses and doctors, were shot just like everybody else. And Mary Ludwig Hayes was doing her thing, and she carried water. And her nickname, because soldiers we give each other nicknames in the military, this lady's nickname was Molly Pitcher. You've probably heard of that. Well, she saw her husband shot and wounded, and he's a part of the cannon team, and she picked up the rod in his place.
She was said to have never missed a beat.
Not only did prominent American educators such as John Witherspoon equip students with a biblical foundation in academic education, but they were so committed to sound education for all students that they directly confronted 2 centuries of tradition and law imposed on them by the British and founded some of the first schools for women and for African Americans, something unheard of at that time. For example, John Witherspoon personally trained a number of African American students at Princeton, including John Chavez, who went on to become a famous preacher and educator in North Carolina. And Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration, was also instrumental in the early development of African American education. And Benjamin Franklin, a signer of both the Declaration and the Constitution, helped found a series of schools for African Americans, training students both in academics and in the principles of Christianity. And Benjamin Rush, another signer of the Declaration, helped open education for women and was intimately involved with the first American school to educate women. These founding fathers and many others set a new direction for education by pioneering education for all children, regardless of race or gender.
Oh, beautiful, for heroes proved in liberating strife. Who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life. America, America, may God thy gold refine.
Separation of church and state means
I don't have to get up in the front of the class and speak in tongues to prove that I have the gift of the Holy Spirit to get an A and graduate high school. Or you prayed to Mary and I don't, so I get an F.
dismissal of spiritual life from social life is a perversion of separation of church and state.
These guys taught themselves to read. Half of these guys were slaves, and 5 years later they're sitting in Congress. And as slaves, it was a capital offense to learn to read. So these guys in 5 years, and I'll guarantee you read their speeches and records of Congress, you better have a dictionary and a thesaurus in both hands because you want to understand the language they use. It is so brilliant what these guys did. And in slavery, Richard Allen was in slavery and he held no bitterness at all. He says, God would not allow bitterness even in Joseph when he was in prison. Do you think God will allow it in us? He said, we can't have bitterness. bitterness. He said, by the way, there were some whites who held us in slavery, but it's whites who are working for our freedom. I mean, these guys had no bitterness. They wouldn't allow it.
Back in just a second. David Barton is here, founder and president of Wall Builders. Lucas Morrell, professor at Washington and Lee University in Virginia. Deneen has a question in our audience.
Yeah, when did this rich history get erased from the textbooks?
Lucas hit it. The losers wrote the history. I mean, that's exactly what happened. Was the loser wrote. You really set something, put it together for me, because my viewpoint was, and you're going to love this. This is red meat for you. Woodrow Wilson changed teaching your history. So
hate that guy.
Woodrow Wilson, when he came into office, he took every black in office in federal government and kicked them all out except one. He left one black in office. He is the first guy.
He resegregated the army.
He resegregated. He's the first guy to show a film at the White House, and the film he showed was Birth of the Nation, a Klan recruiting film.
He called it History Written with Lightning.
That's right.
The NAACP, to their credit, boycotted that movie.
That's right. So he's the guy who wrote the 7-volume History of the American People. And that is the set that suddenly became the whole basis of the way we started teaching 20th century history. It's racist.
No, it's awful.
Can you please explain to the audience that Texas is working to put this in their history books? It's not trying to take out black history as the hype propagated by the media?
Yeah.
So let me get this right. In place of Black History Month, these people are trying to put out this information as part of regular American history, and the media puts it out as they're trying to get rid of Black History Month. Boy, talk about walking over dollars to get a dime. That's sick.
By the media?
Yeah, the media doesn't like what we're doing. I was one of the 6 guys appointed in Texas to help oversee the writing, the standards, one of the experts, and we got every one of these guys back in, and it drives the left crazy.
Back in.
Yeah, back in. Back in. And you know, I love what you said, too, about group. And the national motto is E pluribus unum. Out of many, we became one. And we have tried for 20 years to make it E unum pluribus. Out of one, we're going to be all these groups. And it's back.
Yes.
Good.
Well, what is the motivation behind not disseminating this information? What's the motivation behind the left or whoever it is that doesn't want this information put into the textbooks?
Well, their mentality is that you get what is secure if government gives it to you. The Declaration of Independence says your rights are not the gift of government. You are born with them. You are endowed by your Creator with these. Government exists to protect what you already possess. That is counter 180 degrees to what the typical statist approach to government exists.
Chris.
I'm 37 years old, been out of high school for almost 20 years. I actually went to some of the best schools available, which is Department of Defense dependent schools overseas in Germany, and I felt like I got a great education. But what's really upsetting, especially since I've seen David Barton before and also watching the show, really just hacked me off, as you said, is that I'm just now finding out about these things. I looked at some textbooks from friends of mine who are still in school. They're still teaching about the same 4 to 5 standard black people in history. Pretty much it's always Harriet Tubman, Crispus Attucks, Frederick Douglass. Some of them mention Benjamin Banneker, but it's always the same 4 or 5, as if there was only 4 or 5 black people who contributed to this country throughout its history. And it's just like, why is this still the same way with all the information we have today in 2010?
May I ask a question? Because Javier and Cynthia, you are shaking your heads while he's saying this, and you look a little disgusted by this whole thing. Can you pass, Chris, can you pass?
I was in the audience at your last show where you did this, and I had some very strong comments that I made about Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah.
And what I mentioned specifically on that show was the fact that what I found particularly galling in that instance was there are scholarships for minorities named after Woodrow Wilson.
Right.
And I find a lot of this particularly infuriating because, like Chris, I went to some very good schools. And these are names, aside from maybe 1 or 2 of them, that I had never been exposed to. And I had never heard about until, this day or the last show that we had, the very first time that you had this discussion.
Cynthia, how do you feel?
Well, this is my first time ever hearing this, and I'm a little appalled. I mean, I'm not that far removed from even college, and I took African American courses, and some of this stuff I'm hearing for the first time. And I mean, public education, one thing, but when you're paying for your education and you're not getting this information, it's really, really sad.
It's the American Revolution, William Nell.
Who here even knew? In 1850 what?
1855.
1855, there was a school textbook, Colored Patriots. Who even knew that?
It hasn't been reprinted, but it's on Google Books. If you want to read that book, go to Google Books and you can read. And it's done by a black historian, William Nell, who's the first black to hold any federal office in the federal government.
Jen.
I'm really angry about the rewriting of history and, you know, all this history that's not included in the school's textbooks. And for me, anger motivates me.
I just think that, like Marcus Garvey said, a people without knowledge of their history is like a tree without roots. And this history is really important so that we can change the victim narrative that's monopolized the conversation.
And the same for everyone that is an American. We've got to know our roots. From New York, good night, America.
Whatever the reasons that people become deniers, they often have an agenda which they won't admit to.
Why do you continually denigrate the work of David Irving?
You can have opinions about the Holocaust, but I won't meet with anyone who says the Holocaust didn't happen.
Professor Lifstad, I am that David Irving. And I've got $1,000 to give anyone who can show me a document that proves the Holocaust.
I will not debate you, not here, not now, not
because
ever.
You can't. Well,
you know, I could see a time when our children's children don't believe in the Holocaust.
Done very real damage to my professional existence.
What did you say about him? I think I called him a liar and a falsifier of history.
You better get yourself lawyered up.
A man accuses you of something and it's your job to prove he's wrong. In the U.S., there's a presumption of innocence.
Yeah, not in the UK.
This case is happening to you, but it's not about you.
Auschwitz is at the very center of Holocaust belief, so it's at the very center of Holocaust denial.
There were no gas chambers anywhere at Auschwitz.
Here is one of the largest killing machines in human history.
In my next video, I will be exploring the effects of slavery. This was a request of a friend of mine who suggested I talk about this. And let me tell you, it ain't pretty, and it ain't fun, and it's ugly. It's dark. But it's necessary for us to understand that so we can move on.
We must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred.